Hi, and welcome to the Volunteer Voices session. We'll be talking about the volunteer impact amid COVID-19 survey that we conducted here in Houston, Texas. So let's get started. My name is Brooke Parkinson. I am the director of Volunteer Houston. I am a lifelong nonprofit professional, have always worked for nonprofits, and I'm a lifelong volunteer. I became a certified nonprofit professional a few years ago through the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. And that was in part due to my time in AmeriCorps NCCC. I was stationed at the Charleston, South Carolina campus. And if any of you are familiar with AmeriCorps NCCC, then you know that campus has been closed for many years, and I'm starting to show my age. And for those of you who are into this kind of thing, I am an INTJ personality, and I'll let you look that up on your own time. Let me tell you about Volunteer Houston. Our mission is to connect individuals, groups, and companies with nonprofit agencies here in the area to transform the greater Houston community for good through volunteerism. So we serve 13 counties here in the Gulf Coast region of the state of Texas. We're the Points of Light affiliate in Houston, and we work closely with Harris County, which is where Houston is located, on disaster preparedness and disaster response programs and services, and we're proud to work with them on that effort. I also want to tell you how we got started and found ourselves facilitating this survey. When COVID-19 first arrived, we saw many organizations conducting community impact surveys with various audiences, with businesses, with households, with certain geographic areas, within certain demographics. But we did not see one for volunteers. So we stood up and took on that challenge. And that's why we're here today. Our goal was to, we really wanted to be able to provide hope and insights for nonprofits on how to act and operate and serve and re-engage volunteers during the pandemic. It was such a new territory for everyone that having some data like this could really help nonprofits make some hard and fast decisions. Disclaimer, we are not researchers, but I hope that what you see here is that, when working with the right people and experts in the research industry, that this is certainly something that you can do in your own community. I worked with a gentleman named Dan Warren previously, and he is a trained researcher by profession, and Rachel Kaminsky has done some research work and has the right tools to evaluate some of the data that we collected, and we'll go into what that means here in a minute. So here's how we facilitated the survey. We used SurveyMonkey. It was completely web-based. We promoted it by email to all of the 130,000 plus users in our own database. We shared on our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also sent the link to the nonprofits who are registered with Volunteer Houston and asked them to share with their own volunteers. There might have been some overlap there, but that was okay. We did not feel like we needed to restrict the survey to only volunteers who are registered with us. We wanted volunteers across the community to respond. We collected quantitative and qualitative data. So there were some free response options, which is where Rachel helped us review and analyze some of the data. And of course, we'll take a look at several charts and graphs here as well. Now, Rachel actually used qualitative coding software called NVivo to analyze those free response questions. So we feel confident that we've been able to identify some insights and trends and little golden nuggets for us and for you to take and make decisions as an organization moving forward through the pandemic. So just a little bit of information about the actual respondents. We had a total of 1,753 respond. Everyone who responded completed the survey. There were a handful of optional questions, but the majority were required. Because we promoted on social media and shared with some folks out of state, there were just a few hundred responses that were not here in Texas, but total in Texas, there were just over 1,600. And the map that you see on the screen is a map of Harris County. So downtown sits right there in the middle, where you can see where the zip code boundaries get real small and tight. That's downtown Houston. So this is a zip code map. All of these red lines represent the zip code boundaries. And those stars that you see on the screen represent the zip codes that had the highest number of respondents. And that ranged anywhere from 21 to 38 respondents in each of these blue star zip codes. I thought this was really interesting because we see that most of our active volunteers are falling on the, get my directions right, on the west side of town. And for those of you who are not familiar with Houston, our west side of town is the more affluent side of town. So this has been such an eye opener for us. To me, this means that Volunteer Houston as an organization needs to do a lot more work on the east side of our community, specifically Harris County, to engage more people in the work that we're all doing and that all of our nonprofits are doing. Let's dig into the questions. The very first question we asked was, what type of volunteer are you? And they were allowed to check more than one answer. So let me quickly describe what each of the answer options were. The first was a long-term volunteer. So they typically volunteer for one organization for many years. Second is a short-term volunteer. So they'll volunteer for one organization, but in short spurts. They may come and go. They're not very consistent. The third is an explorer. So that volunteer likes to volunteer for a number of different organizations, and they don't necessarily feel obligated to just one. The fourth is a specialized volunteer. So they bring a specific skill to the table. Lawyers, accountants, you name it, data analysts, it could be anything. The next is a traveling volunteer. So these volunteers are willing, the way we worded the description was to drive all the way across Houston, which can take hours at certain times of the day and week, to follow through on a volunteer commitment. This could also be across the state. Next is a mandatory volunteer. So those who are required to accumulate so many hours of community service, be it for school or for jail sentences. I don't know the correct terminology there. A handful of folks said none of these apply to them, and a few others gave their own description. What's interesting here is the two highest responses came in for explorers. That's in yellow. Those are the ones that would like to volunteer for more than just one organization. 48% of our respondents identified as an explorer. And then the next closest, just under that, is our long-term volunteers. So you have this dichotomy of volunteers who are extremely obligated to one organization, and they will be committed to that organization for years and years. And then you have a population, an audience of volunteers who like to bounce around. And so I think what that means to us as nonprofit leaders is we need to get familiar with who each of our individual volunteers are and learn about where else they volunteer, if at all. And you know, maybe there's a way, maybe there's not a way to create volunteer opportunities that cater to those different styles. So this is question number one. We also asked in two separate questions. Question was worded the same way. However, there was a before and an after version. So before and after the pandemic, how often did you volunteer your time and skills? We're talking about frequency here. And so I've highlighted some of the numbers to make it easier to read. The answer options were what you see in blue on the left side. So they could choose daily, weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, 1 to 2 times a year, or 3 or more times a year. Of those, well, those who responded to the before the pandemic, we see the majority, and there was really a close tie between weekly and monthly. Those are the most volunteers are going to fall into one of those two categories or one of those two frequencies, weekly or monthly. However, after the pandemic, we saw that volunteers, or the majority of volunteers, dropped or decreased their frequency to just 1 to 2 times per year. So that was about a third of respondents are now only volunteering 1 to 2 times per year. However, in that same category, both before and after, if their answer was 1 to 2 times before and 1 to 2 times after the pandemic hit, that's where we saw the biggest change. And it was an increase. So those volunteers who maybe only, or those people who only volunteer 1 or 2 times a year, seem to be more willing to there seem to be more volunteers who are willing to volunteer 1 or 2 times a year after a pandemic hits. And that's where, so it was interesting to see that there was that much of an increase in that category, or in that interest level for frequency. That could be because some volunteers are volunteering less, right? You see the decreases in weekly and monthly. So those folks after a pandemic hits are less likely to volunteer as frequently. We asked another before and after question, and that was how many hours per month, keyword month, did or do you volunteer? In both instances, before and after, the majority of volunteers are ready to commit 4 to 10 hours per month to volunteering. And it comes as no surprise that those who are committing 0 hours on a monthly basis increased. So the number of volunteers who want to dedicate 0 hours increased after the pandemic hit. That's where we saw the biggest change, a 12% increase. So I think this is validating probably what we all think, but you'll see in the next few slides that there's still hope. So those. These are 2 separate questions. How comfortable are you with in-person volunteer opportunities after the pandemic hit, and how comfortable are you with virtual volunteer opportunities after a pandemic hit? You know, after we facilitated this survey, it really came to light that we needed to better define what virtual means. And the reality is that there are 2 meanings, and we can use 2 words to define that. Virtual really is digital, connected via web from some other location. So you have to have the right technology to volunteer virtually. However, there are also remote volunteers who can volunteer their time, their skills away from the office, the volunteer the nonprofit office or a nonprofit facility, but they don't necessarily need to be connected to the web to do that. So that's remote work. Unfortunately, we did not distinguish that difference in this survey, besides wording it in the question. And if and when you read the full report, you'll see that the question, it defined virtual as to include remote volunteer opportunities. So what we see is, on average, on a scale of 1 to 100, out of the 1,700 plus respondents, 47 is the average rating of those who are willing to volunteer in person. Virtually, the number is 81. The average is 81 on a scale of 1 to 100 again. So we see there's much more interest in volunteering virtually or remotely than in person, but there are still people out there who are willing and ready to volunteer in person. And I think all communities have seen, I know here in Houston and Harris County, the majority of the in-person volunteer opportunities have been centered around delivering those essential services, mostly food distribution. And so there have certainly been a high number of people, of volunteers out there working with so many organizations who address food insecurity during these times, because food insecurity has certainly increased across the community. Okay, so this one is tricky. I'm going to explain it to you. What we're looking at is the responses and feelings toward in-person opportunities and virtual opportunities based on those qualitative responses, or those free text responses. So we're looking at a pie chart. The blue section represents the comfort and safety of volunteering virtually. Now these topics, these themes were pulled out from keywords that were used frequently in the free text responses. So blue is comfort and safety volunteering virtually. I'm going clockwise. Orange is comfort of volunteering in person. So you see everything to the right of the red line slicing the pie is addressing comfort. Now we move on to the gray section, and that is representing discomfort volunteering in person. And the yellow sliver, so small sliver, is representing discomfort volunteering virtually. So everything to the left of the red line represents discomfort. Now let's look at the green line. The green line is slicing the pie almost in half as well. However, on the left side, that represents in-person opportunities. And on the right side of the green line, that represents virtual opportunities. What's interesting is you see just about the same level of discomfort and comfort volunteering in person and virtually. So that's the gray section and the blue section. That one's a tough one to interpret. We have to sit there and look and read for a second. What's most important is that there are so many volunteers and people who are ready and willing to volunteer from home, remotely or virtually, and that's what this data is showing us. Here's another way of looking at the comfort levels of in-person and virtual opportunities, and I'm going to focus on the blue section. So this chart here is a hierarchy chart. The size of each square represents the number of themes, keywords related to that descriptor. So we could say the blue section represents comfort and safety volunteering virtually. And we've got about a third of respondents fall into that category. But you see the sub-theme that's on the right side of the blue box. That's the number of volunteers, a representative of the number of volunteers who feel prepared for virtual opportunities. In other words, they have the right technology and or the right skills to volunteer virtually. So there's this group of people who are ready and willing, they just don't know how, or they don't have the tools to. And so that's something that nonprofits can potentially address with volunteers. If you have the technology to share, if you have the resources to prepare a training on how to use whatever technology tools you're requiring of your volunteers, it's something that should not be skipped and absolutely addressed with the volunteers that you have. For the sake of just sharing the information with you, you'll see the gray section represents discomfort volunteering in person. That's about a third of the respondents. And on the right side of the screen, the orange section there represents comfort and volunteering in person, as long as they have proper safety protocols are in place, as long as they know that the nonprofit they're volunteering for is going to protect them and set up the space in a safe way, then volunteers are ready to be there in person for you. The last little corner down there in yellow is discomfort and volunteering virtually. So again, that's the lack of proper equipment. They maybe just don't like virtual, or they're unsure of the effectiveness of volunteering virtually, which to me means, you know, when you have or do anything virtually, you begin to lose that human contact. So as you're developing virtual volunteer opportunities with your volunteers, remember that one of the benefits and one of the motivators for volunteers is to know and understand the impact that they're having on the community or on your clients. And so even when you're volunteering virtually, if we can't be there in person, think about the ways that you can continue that human impact and continue to remind volunteers of what kind of impact they're having. So video like this is very important. You know, sharing notes, even if they're handwritten notes, back and forth, phone calls to say thank you. Did you know that when you did this, our clients benefited in this way? I think we just have to get a little bit more creative about how we communicate that impact to volunteers, even though we're not seeing them in person much anymore. And here's one more look at the in-person versus virtual qualitative responses. I like this one the most, and it's because if we look at the yellow and blue sections, the yellow section represents those who are neutral or have no impact on volunteering. or the pandemic had no impact on their volunteering motivations. The blue section represents a decrease in volunteer efforts due to the pandemic. And so we see that those two populations are fairly equal. So again, this validates that many volunteers are just not motivated to volunteer in the midst of a pandemic. But the yellow section here represents hope. These are people who are probably on the fence. You know, I want to, they have a desire, they're motivated to volunteer, but they're not sure how to go about doing it. They're not sure they have the right tools or skills. They're not sure what the opportunities are. So I think that we as nonprofit leaders have an opportunity to recruit them to our side, right? They still need to be engaged. If they're engaged, if they're reached out to, if they're asked, then I believe they will step up to the plate. But we have to reassure them, which brings us to barriers and incentives. Now, this data came out of those qualitative responses as well, the free text responses. I think it goes without saying that we need to address the concerns of our volunteers so that we can lift those barriers for them. We don't want to rely on the volunteers to lift those barriers on their own. We want to give them an opportunity to follow their passion and give them some fulfillment. I think we all as humans want to know that we're making an impact, that we can help our neighbors, our friends, our fellow Houstonians in this case. But nonprofits play a vital role in communicating to volunteers how they can do that, in training volunteers in how to do that, and then in sharing with volunteers the impact that has. So let's look at some of these barriers. Again, this hierarchical chart, the size of the boxes is representative of the number of respondents in that category. Within the darker blue box, you have subsets of themes. So blue represents barriers, orange represents incentives. Let's go through the barriers first. Volunteers believe that there are a lack of opportunities to volunteer. Again, I think this comes down to communication. Although I'll admit, I know we saw here in Houston that many nonprofits either simply had to close their doors due to the pandemic temporarily, or they just weren't prepared to pivot, weren't sure how to pivot, or didn't have the resources to pivot to virtual or remote opportunities. We were so accustomed to operating in person that it just took time for many of those nonprofits to switch gears. And so now we're starting to see more nonprofits start to reopen right now. And they will be able to then promote those volunteer opportunities again to those people who are willing to volunteer during a pandemic. So the biggest response, the most frequent response was lack of opportunities. They just don't know what exists out there. Second most is safety concerns. Again, volunteers want to know that they're going to be taken care of or protected when they are volunteering in person. The next most frequent was depends on requirements. Again, I think this is the communication issue. I think we have to be clear. Yes, we need volunteers on this day at this time, but what are you going to ask me to do? And do I need to do anything to prepare for it? Or are you going to prepare me for it when I get there? Those are the thoughts that are going through a volunteer's mind. Next most frequent is not enough time. There are certainly a number of folks out there who have more time on their hands after the pandemic hit, but there is also a population of people who have much less time. I think for those of us who have been working remotely and from home, it's just amazing how much more time I spend in meetings, in Zoom meetings. And that's because we can't just do the walk by the office anymore. Now we have to actually schedule time. But also we see many healthcare workers who I think there is a certain number of healthcare workers who were volunteering their time, but that time is now taken up by actual work needs and addressing the pandemic issues in our own community. And then the least most mentioned sub-theme was skill utilization. So maybe they just don't think that their skills are needed, or maybe the skills they have are not needed at the organization that they want to volunteer for. So again, in our communication to volunteers, when you post that volunteer need, it is so important to add all of this information, to be detailed with your expectations, not just the logistics, day, time, address, but tell us more about the work or in the skills that are needed. I think it's perfectly okay to look at a volunteer opportunity as a job description. Be specific about what you're asking of your volunteers. They will live up to it if you can communicate what the expectations are. So let's switch gears to incentives now. I think we all know that our volunteers are passionate people. They're passionate about the causes and the missions that all of our nonprofits stand for. And that goes back to how volunteers really want to understand the impact that they as an individual are making on the community or on your nonprofit's clients. And we see more volunteers with more free time. I think there's a balance of both, right? There are some people there's a balance of those who are willing to volunteer in person in the pandemic, and vice versa. There are a certain number of volunteers who have more free time than they did before, and vice versa. All of this to say, there are still people out there who are willing to volunteer. They're ready to volunteer. We just need to be very intentional about the messaging that we are pushing out to the volunteer audience about what's needed. I think it's too, we can get really tied down and deep into the data and the numbers, but I want to share with you some verbatim quotes from some of the respondents' responses. In their own words, when we asked them to tell us how the pandemic has changed your volunteering efforts, this is exactly what was shared. It has inspired me to volunteer more, but I haven't found an opportunity that is attractive enough. Again, you've got to get crafty with those volunteer job descriptions, creative. It's given me time to think about what I want to do, which is help people. I'm not educated enough on certain topics, but I believe volunteering my time with certain organizations could teach me more. We've seen this in data before. Many people are motivated to volunteer just to learn a new skill. So that training component of your volunteer engagement and volunteer onboarding is uber important. If you communicate that you are going to train them, that they don't need any skills, they're more like those who feel like they might not be qualified to volunteer will step up. But you've got to assure them that you're going to train them and that you'll provide them that guidance along the way. I have yet to find the right fit in how to volunteer during the pandemic, but my efforts remain the same or have increased. So here, we see the volunteer that's still willing to volunteer. It's just a matter of finding that right fit. And granted, during this pandemic, we've seen so many volunteer opportunities, again, that are mostly in person, or many of the virtual opportunities have been really centered around crafts, if I may say. So writing those care cards, thinking about you to some of our senior clients. Although there was one project that was really cool, Operation Gratitude asked folks to make those P-cord bracelets for veterans, because that went in a care package for veterans in the community. So that's a perfect example of a remote opportunity. You don't have to be connected to technology in any way to write a card or to braid a bracelet. I've participated in several short projects rather than leaving my house to volunteer for several hours. A good example of this would be going to the grocery store to pick up cereal boxes, to drive to a nonprofit facility, a food bank, that doesn't have to be a food bank, to drop off food that they donate. Then you've got a combination of a donation and a volunteer time there. College is moved to online, so I am not getting the same level of education, and I am also unemployed from the virus. This is a scary one. Can you imagine what it would feel like to be a college student who's just not getting that same engagement that they get from being in a classroom with fellow students and talking to a professor face to face and not having a job? Man, they're feeling a little lost. I can only imagine. And I see this speaks to that training component of volunteer engagement. It is incredibly important to communicate that training component, to include that training component, and think about the training that you offer doesn't necessarily have to be high level accredited, but it should be structured, and you should communicate what the learning objectives are. And if you know that you're looking for a specific skill or training in a specific skill, consider promoting your volunteer opportunities to those colleges that offer a degree program in that skill that you're needing. That could be a great volunteer recruitment resource for you. And lastly, you just feel safer either dropping off meals with little contact or doing something virtually. So we say it runs the gamut. I think at the end of this, the conclusion I came to is that there are more or less equal amounts of volunteers who are ready and willing to volunteer in person as there are virtually. We just have to change up our tactics and how we communicate and reach and engage those volunteers. So it requires a pivot, it requires a change, it requires being open to that change. And one of the best ways I've seen that happen is by relying on each other. I will brag on the Houston Food Bank here in town and Baker Ripley here in town are two organizations who have mastered the art of creating a safe environment for their volunteers and their clients as they distribute food or whatever other services they're providing. And so many other local, smaller nonprofits here are learning from those two leaders in this community on how to get that done. So I would encourage you to reach out to your fellow nonprofit professionals and connect with each other and learn what you're doing. I'm going to close with this. Some of you may have heard of the book, The One Thing by Gary Keller. It's a great read. It's a great explanation of how to manage your time and manage your priorities. He says, if you chase two rabbits, you will not catch either one. So I encourage you to think about what you saw today, what you heard today, and filter out all of the other things and focus on the one takeaway that you have from this content and what will you put into practice, if anything. I hope that you learned something new or found a nugget of data that you can take and run with and can help you and your organization make some decisions moving forward. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to see a copy of the full volunteer survey results, give me a shout. You can reach me at info@volunteerhouston.org. You can look me up on LinkedIn, Brooke Parkinson, with Volunteer Houston. And I hope you guys have a fabulous time at the virtual Point of Light conference this week.